Welcome to the art and science of mead. Stuck fermentations, how to prevent and address them. Stuck and sluggish fermentations. So what is a stuck or sluggish fermentation? Essentially, it's when yeast fermentation slows down or stops altogether before fermentation has been completed. There's still residual sugar present, which if you want to dry mead is unwanted. And also, if you bottle this without stabilization, it can actually result in bottle bombs in worst case situation. The causes are multiple, and the prevention and solution of stuck or sluggish fermentation will depend on exactly what the underlying cause was. So how do you know when fermentation is complete? It's essential we know that so that we don't have any unwanted carbonation in the bottle, or worst case scenario, bottles that blow up or corks that are pushed out. Bubbles in the airlock do not mean a thing. You can have off-gassing with changes in atmospheric pressure. There could still be some sugar left, even though the yeast has stopped actively working, at least for now. So even though the bubbles are no longer bubbling in your airlock, it doesn't mean anything. The best way is to measure our specific gravity or Brix. Ideally every few days, at the minimum at the beginning, like before you pitch the yeast, so you know what your starting gravity is, and then at the end to know that you have achieved dryness. If you measure the specific gravity or Brix every few days, you know if fermentation is coming to an end as expected, or in worst case situation, it's getting stuck. And once the gravity or Brix has been stable, that will tell us that the yeast has done its job and fermentation is complete. But if you take hydrometer readings every few days, you'll know that something is going on and perhaps the fermentation is becoming sluggish or stuck. For example, if there's not much of a change in the Brix or gravity for several days, and then it finally begins decreasing, that's what we call a long lag. So basically the yeast took a while to get going. There's a lot of explanations for that. Perhaps you used an old packet of yeast, or the yeast was mistreated. Perhaps you did not use enough yeast. Maybe you underpitched the yeast and it just took a while for the population to build up. Or maybe there was some kind of stress. Maybe you did not rehydrate it properly, or you did something you shouldn't have that caused the yeast population to be low or the yeast to be sluggish before it started. But it finally did get going and it did complete the fermentation. A sluggish fermentation, the hydrometer readings show that the gravity is changing, but doing much more slowly than you would expect. A lot of things can cause that. It could even be something as simple as the temperature is too cold where you're trying to pull off that fermentation. Or it could have been that, again, similar to long lag, maybe the yeast population was too low or the packet of yeast was old. And then finally, there's a stuck fermentation where it starts off fairly normally, but then it just stops partway through, and there's no further change in your gravity reading. And that basically is a stuck fermentation, and there's still sugar present. And now you have to decide, do I want to leave it as is and stabilize it and be okay with that, or do I want to try to restart that? Before we talk about how to restart a stuck fermentation, it's important to understand what the potential causes are, and there are multiple possible causes of a sluggish or stuck fermentation. Some of them include some of the ones that I've already mentioned. Perhaps you underpitched the yeast, and there's not enough yeast cells, so it took a while for them to get going. You might have pitched enough yeast, but perhaps the yeast was dead or it was an old packet. Other situations, if the sugar content is too high, let's say you're trying to pull off a fermentation with a very high starting gravity, maybe you're trying to make a sack mead or a Polish mead, some yeasts struggle with that. And if you did not try to adjust or get the yeast adapted to that, it might have trouble or even become completely stuck. Not enough nutrients, so the yeast maybe starts off and kind of starts working, but it runs out of nutrients. Not enough oxygen. If the alcohol level is too high, some of us like to make our mead with a very high alcohol, and it's a tough job for the yeast to pull that off. So sometimes just simply having too much alcohol will be enough to cause the yeast to stop working. And some yeast strains, of course, are more tolerant of high alcohol as compared to other ones. Perhaps the pH is too low. Yeast is fairly forgiving, but let's say you have other issues. Maybe it's a very high sugar content, nutrient deficiency, and now the pH is too low. Sometimes it's all of those together. But in particular, if you're trying to ferment something that's very acidic, such as citrus fruit-based meads, that might be something that affects yeast. Temperature issues, too hot, too cold, or rapid fluctuations. Excess sulfites, we sometimes will add sulfites at the beginning if we're making a fruit-based must or perhaps a piment from grapes we pressed ourselves. And then finally, there's buildup of toxins, either from the yeast itself or perhaps from other microbia that were within the must. So the yeast population too low. So if there's not much activity from the beginning, maybe there's a yeast problem. As I already mentioned, maybe not enough yeast or it was an old yeast. If the yeast was not hydrated properly, that could also result in a lower inoculation of active, healthy, viable yeast cells. The sugar content was too high. So I still occasionally see pictures in books or even videos online where they just pour the dry yeast right into the must. That's not recommended. Not that it doesn't work. I did it back in the day, like 25 plus years ago, before I knew what I was doing. And there may still be some surviving yeast cells, and it may eventually begin fermenting, but it really does stress the yeast out. So always rehydrate. We usually recommend products like GoForm, for example, but you don't have to do that. You could just use tap water, as ideally without chlorine, of course. We did that for years, simply letting the yeast rehydrate in water for, say, 15 or 20 minutes, and then putting it into the must will help it adapt to that much better. If you're trying to ferment difficult fermentation, like very high bricks, then you might try to use a yeast such as Uvaform 43 or some other ones. Or you might try to get the yeast to be acclimated to that high bricks must. Nutrient deficiency. So too little nutrients or not adding the nutrients in a timely fashion when the yeast needs it, that could cause the fermentation to slow down. So we recommend calculating how much nutrients your must will require and then adding them when the yeast needs them. If you notice some off aromas, and in particular hydrogen sulfide, rotten egg, that's a clue the yeast might be stressed from insufficient nutrients. And many times I'll take a sniff of a fermenting batch and I will smell a little bit of hydrogen sulfide and I'll know, oh, I better add my nutrient addition now so that the yeast doesn't have any other problems. Too little oxygen. We don't really recommend degassing like a lot of folks do. It's not really so much the CO2 that's toxic, at least when you're fermenting in a non-pressurized vessel, but the yeast does need oxygen, and so you can add it by direct oxygenation, such as bubbling in with a stainless steel stone, or you can stir vigorously, or a commercial mead maker might do a pump over. So if you also notice some of these reductive aromas, that can also be a clue that there was too little aeration during initial fermentation. Obviously, you're not going to do this later in fermentation because you don't want to cause oxidation. I'm talking about the first few days of active fermentation where you would want to oxygenate or aerate. Too much alcohol. Alcohol is a toxin, not just to humans, but also to yeast. And as the alcohol levels increase, the yeast will begin slowing down. If you are trying to ferment higher than that yeast strain's alcohol tolerance, you could have a stuck fermentation. Even with some of the more alcohol-tolerant yeasts, it can still be a struggle if everything else is not perfectly in line, nutrients, oxygenation, and so on. Another cause of a stuck fermentation is the pH is too low. This is most likely to be of a concern in a pie or a melomel because the acids in the juice can lower the pH by too much, stressing the yeast. Yeast is very forgiving. Usually if the pH is greater than 3.1, it's not a problem, but I've fermented batches with a pH much lower than that without problems. If I am going to make a mead using a highly acid fruit or fruit juice, such as citrus fruit, often I will ferment the mead first and then add the citrus fruit or juice after the fermentation is complete in order to avoid any problems with too low of a pH. I also do the same thing with cranberries and lingonberries, not only because of the acid, but they also have another a compound called benzoic acid, which can suppress fermentation as well. Temperature can also be a problem at times. Besides affecting the quality of your product, it can also affect active alcoholic fermentation. Too low of a temperature can cause yeast to stop fermenting. Some yeasts are more tolerant of low temperatures than others. And the same thing in reverse. If the temperature is too high, that can also stress the fermentation and ultimately cause a stuck fermentation. But again, there are some strains of yeast which can tolerate higher temperatures. And then also excessive temperature variation. So the temperature might not be too low or too high, but it fluctuates. This could be if it's in a room or, say, a garage where the temperature goes higher during the day and then drops at night and so on. That can also stress the yeast enough to cause problems in fermentation. So excess sulfites. So if you accidentally or unintentionally add it early in fermentation, we do use sulfites occasionally when we're making a mead out of grapes or fruit that we are pressing. And some of those might actually have some wild microflora on them, so we might hit them with sulfite and then 24 hours later pitch with our selected strain of yeast. If you pitched too early, then that perhaps could affect it. Some yeast strains produce sulfites on their own, and that can affect fermentation as well. But most of the time, it's not enough to negatively affect yeast fermentation, although it might affect other fermentations, such as malolactic bacteria. And then there's buildup of toxins. So these are basically metabolites that are produced by the yeast themselves, such as medium-chain fatty acids. You can have acetic acid. That's not always by Acetobacter. Yeast can produce some volatile acidity itself. If you happen to catch it early enough, you can add yeast hulls and stir up the leaves, and that can absorb them and pull them out. And that can help the fermentation get going again. But you need to always recognize it as early as possible, because if you wait, sometimes the damage is done, and it might be a lot harder to restart a fermentation that's completely stuck as compared to one that was simply sluggish from being stressed. So how to address a stuck fermentation? If the fermentation is not too far along and it's sluggish rather than completely stuck, sometimes you only need to do a few things and the problem fixes itself. If you did not yet add nutrients, or you're running a little bit late in one of the staggered nutrient additions, add nutrients. If you think the pH is too low and you measure it, you might try increasing it. Simply stirring the yeast back into suspension, aerating and oxygenating, especially in the first 24 to 48 hours, can be very helpful. If the temperature is too low, try to increase it. Put it in a place where the temperature is a little bit warmer. If your initial starting gravity or Brix is too high, you might consider diluting it. And if you think there was a problem with the yeast itself, try repitching some more yeast after you rehydrate it according to our usual protocol. And these measures sometimes are enough, but they usually only work before there's a lot of alcohol present. Once you get over 9% or so, it's a little bit more challenging to restart, and you have to use other measures. Once fermentation is more advanced, then you need to use other measures. There are several protocols online, but in general, they involve the following: adding yeast hulls to absorb some of the toxins and metabolites that the yeast has produced. That's so when you add new yeast, it will have less of a problem restarting your stuck fermentation. Adding a complex yeast nutrient, and then making up another starter batch, or we call it the restart batch, using a yeast that is tolerant of high alcohol and difficult fermentation conditions. And then over time, you slowly transfer the stuck mead into that new batch where you're trying to restart it. And you do it slowly so the yeast can slowly acclimate to the stuck mead and the difficult fermentation conditions. So this is a protocol that I use, and you start basically by adding yeast hulls about 1 to 1.5 grams per gallon, and you do that about 24 to 48 hours prior to restarting. If you are going to use lysozyme, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, you could add the lysozyme before this or right around the time of this. And then after about 24 or 48 hours, you would rack the stuck mead off of the yeast hulls. And then you add a complex yeast nutrient to your stuck mead. This is Fermade K or Fermade O, and how much will depend on how much residual sugar is present. If there's more left that the yeast needs to ferment, then you would use more nutrients because the yeast has more work to do. Whereas if the Brix is much lower, then you might not need to add as much, or maybe not even any at all, again, depending on how much residual sugar you have. So you make up your restart batch in another fermentation vessel, and you mix roughly equal volumes of water and stuck mead so that you're basically diluting that. And this should be about 2 to 5% of the total volume of your stuck mead. If the stuck mead is already relatively sweet, then you may not need to add any additional sugar, but if it's already fairly advanced, you should add a little bit of sugar or honey to this restart batch so that it's about 5% or about 5 Brix. And that's so that the yeast has something to begin working on and begin re-fermenting. You need to choose a fructophilic and alcohol-tolerant yeast. My favorite is Uvaferm 43, K1V1116, and some others will also work. And then you calculate how much of this yeast you need to use based on the total volume of your stuck mead, and try to use at least 2 or 2.5 grams of yeast per gallon or even more. You want there to be a lot of yeast cells available. It is going to be difficult for even an alcohol-tolerant yeast to restart a stuck batch, especially if the alcohol levels are very high. So don't be shy in regards to how much yeast you use to restart. You rehydrate this yeast as per usual protocol with GoFerm in warm water, and then after that you pitch that into the restart batch. You are now ready to begin transferring over some of the stuck mead into the restart batch. It's very important that the temperature of the stuck mead and the restart batch are about the same. You're asking the yeast to restart a batch of mead that has become stuck, and the last thing you want is for there to be any additional stress due to differences in temperature. So you add about 10% or so of the stuck mead over to the restart batch, and then you wait until there is yeast activity present. This could be as early as 30 minutes or an hour after you transferred that over, or it might be longer. It might be up to 24 hours. You transfer over another 20% or so, and then you wait again until there is yeast activity. And you can determine if yeast activity is present either through visualization, you might see airlock activity or foaming, or a little bit more of a scientific and precise way of determining this is to measure the Brix right after you had transferred some stuck meat over, and then remeasure it, and if there has been a drop, say of 50% or so, you know that it's ready to transfer over some more. And then you continue to repeat, adding 20% or so of the stuck meat over until all of the meat has been transferred over to your restart batch. And hopefully, by the time all of the stuck mead has been transferred over, it has been restarted. I mentioned lysozyme earlier. Lysozyme is an enzyme that inhibits spoilage bacteria, specifically Lactobacillus and Enococcus. You wouldn't expect this to be a problem, say, in a traditional mead or a mead that was made with clean fruit juice. But if you used fruit that was moldy or beginning to ferment on its own, or it was overripe, that could be a problem because the bacteria can compete with the yeast for nutrients and also release metabolites that inhibit the yeast. So prior to step 1 of that protocol I just described, you might add a little bit of sulfites, about 25 parts per million or so, and then add lysozyme. You wait about 24 hours, you aerate, and then you proceed with step 1, adding the yeast holes and so on, because by inhibiting these bacteria, that can also give the yeast that you're going to use to try to restart your batch an advantage to getting it restarted. So that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation, Stuck Fermentations. With modern mead-making techniques, stuck fermentations should be rare. You can try to minimize that from happening by always pitching a sufficient amount of yeast and rehydrating that yeast properly, always using fresh yeast and compared to old yeast. Make sure you use nutrient additions, and then aerate and oxygenate, especially early in fermentation. The first 24 to 40 hours is most important. Try to avoid starting gravity bricks that's too high, or trying to aim for an alcohol level that's too high. Now, of course, sometimes we may be aiming for a high alcohol level, such as some of the traditional Polish meads or even sack meads. But if we are doing that, be aware those are batches that are more likely to become stuck, and just pay attention to that so we can deal with it before it completely is stuck, and it will be a little bit harder to restart. Try to avoid temperature issues. Try to avoid both being too cold or too warm. Monitor the pH, especially in batches where this is more likely to be a problem, like highly acidic fruit. Avoid excess sulfites early on. And then consider using yeast holes to manage or prevent buildup of toxins later on in fermentation. But always keep in mind, prevention is always much better than trying to fix after the fact. It's always easier to get a sluggish fermentation going again as compared to one that is completely stuck and is stopped. We often watch our airlocks and assume that fermentation is progressing, but be aware sometimes the airlock can be having bubbles in it, and that's just simply off-gassing of previously formed carbon dioxide, and it doesn't mean that the yeast is necessarily fermenting along exactly the way you want. So to be sure, use your hydrometer to measure the gravity in bricks during this fermentation so that you know the fermentation is going along as it should, and if it is starting to slow down and become sluggish, you can take action before it's completely stuck. There's a lot of information online. Here are some of the references that I used and that I recommend. There's some other protocols that others have that are similar to this one. I encourage you to do as much reading and learning on your own. Hopefully stuck fermentations will be rare for you, or perhaps never happen, but I hope this presentation will help you learn or know what to do in the event that you do have a stuck fermentation. Thank you for watching this presentation. I wish you the best in making the best mead possible. Thank you, and cheers!